各位同事，我
Members, it's the appointed time and there is a quorum. Let's get started with the meeting. Item 1, confirmation of minutes of meeting. There are 2 sets of minutes of meeting circulated to members earlier, and that is the minutes of meeting held on the 8th of May 2017, paper number CB bracket for 1351/6017, and also minutes of meeting held on the 12th of June and 1361/1617. The Secretariat has not received any proposed amendments. Any further views from members? If not, then let's get the minutes confirmed. Item 2, information papers issued since the last meeting. After the last meeting, the Secretary has issued 3 papers, and the details have been set out in the revised agenda. And Mr. Ted Hui and Ms. Claudia Mo have written to me on the 14th of July, and they would like to follow up on the matter regarding the last-minute withdrawal of RTHK TV program Headliner on the 30th of June. And I've asked the Secretariat to forward the recommendations of Mr. Ted Hui and Ms. Claudia Mo to the government and ask the government to make a response. And Ms. Mo's and Mr. Hui's letters have been circulated to members for reference. And I believe that today you have received a reply from the government, which has been tabled. And the letters sets that the CA will refer the complaints to its Broadcast Complaints Committee for consideration. And the Broadcast Complaints Committee will consider all relevant information and make a ruling or decision. And since the CA is handling the relevant complaints, this bureau considers it appropriate to discuss the captioned matter at the panel at this stage. So, members, do you have any views on that? Ms. Mo, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, TVB has done this thing, and this is very scary, because this is no ordinary kind of complaint. And TVB blatantly breaches its licensing conditions and has been telling lies to try to cover up its ingratiating the and also political and censorship. And it is instead accusing the RTHK of not having professionalism. The licensing conditions set out clearly that from one Monday to Friday in the evening hours, TVB has to broadcast half-an-hour program of the RTHK. The TVB would rather broadcast cartoons. Instead of Xi Jinping's address, and it's suddenly withdraw the program Headliner, saying that there was some breaking news. And you said the government has made a reply today, and it's said that they have received 340 complaints, and they will wait for the Broadcasting Complaints Committee under CA to look at them. What further there is to study? The situation is a blatant breach. All the facts are known to us, so let's not allow them to do this again. People will forget about it sometime, and then there will be no end to the story. So I hope that at the panel we should discuss this ASAP. Now we've got 2 items which will will entail lengthy discussion. Let's have 1 minute for each member. Mr. James Tao, I think it's we should study into this. I know that the CA said that it is established a mechanism to do it, but I think we should rather discuss the system and how the mechanism works. Is it the case that the licensing conditions now are not clear, and that there are not enough regulations? And is it the case that the penalty is not deterrent enough? The TVB has to broadcast RTHK programs. And the programs are meant to be, say, important messages for the public. And RTHK is very much a public broadcaster. So we hope that programs can be broadcast through terrestrial TV stations. So that's why we are seeing these licensing conditions. And I think we need to discuss the matter. Any other view from any other member? Mr. Martin Liao. Madam Chair. Now, the committee is now investigating into this incident. I think we should wait till the committee has finished its investigations to see whether the licensing conditions have been breached. What I want to say is that when TVB obtained a license, the license came with certain licensing conditions, and they were compiled based on the prevailing conditions then. And at that time, RTHK didn't have spectrum, didn't have airtime, so they needed other terrestrial TV stations to help broadcast their programs. But now, RTHK has its own TV channels, has taken over ATV's channels. So do we need to review the licensing conditions now? I think it's time that a review be undertaken. Mr. Jeffrey Lam. Madam Chair, according to reports, TVB has asked for this from the relevant parties. There have been different messages which have not been confirmed and which are spreading around. We've got the CA, which is responsible for investigating into the matter. So I don't think it should be the case that the electrical should investigate into everything and should study everything. Well, if that is done, what purpose will the CA serve? Since the CA announces that it will look into the matter, well, let's wait for them to deal with it. And if needed, maybe we can further discuss it here. So is there a need for us to discuss it? No, I don't think so. Yes, I've heard your views. And you are concerned about the licensing conditions and whether a review is needed, and that should be discussed. Now, my suggestion is, because it's the last meeting of the current legislative session, I suggest that this item on licensing conditions for TV stations and the relevant mechanism be postponed to the next legislative session and the next panel for it to discuss. Madam Chair. They are asking for a special meeting to discuss this. Well, this is the last meeting. Well, what are you talking about? You can have special meetings. You can do it before the 25th or the 26th of July. While other members say that we should wait till the CA has finished its study and the Broadcast Complaints Committee has finished its study before we discuss the matter. A number of members seem to be saying that we should not be focusing on this isolated incident, but rather we should discuss the mechanism. Well, if that is the case, then we don't need a special meeting to discuss the mechanism. Well, this is something of public concern. We are very concerned about whether the mechanism works. So that can be a matter of urgency too. No, I don't see any urgency in this. Let's maybe discuss it at the next meeting, and then we can look at the entire mechanism. I think we should convene a special meeting. So, what's your view? Do we need a special meeting? I don't see a lot of members are asking for a special meeting. Mr. To, do you want to put the matter to the vote? Yes. Do you want to claim a division for the vote, Mr. To? All right. Let's put that to the vote, and that is whether we should convene a special meeting to discuss the TVB's withdrawal at the last minute of RTHK's program headliner. All right. You have to have the bell rung.
但係而家我哋夠人，仲使唔使響鐘？
We do have a quorum. Do we need to ring the bell? Yes. Yes, we still need to ring the bell for 5 minutes.
點解會冇鐘？而家唔。 議員。邊個？哦，易志明。係咪全部都係啊？呢邊嗰啲易志明議員唔係咩？易志明議員，易志明議。
Mr. Frankie Yik is not a member of the panel, right?
好，而家呢，我哋
Okay. On TVB's sudden withdrawal of headliners, do we need to have a special meeting? We'll put it to the vote. Will those in favour please raise their hands?
毛孟靜議員、
Miss Claudia Mo, Eddie Chu, Raymond Chan, Leung Kwok Hong, Elvin Young, Charles Mock, James Toh, Raymond Chan, right? Okay, those who are against, please raise your hands. Felix Chung, Regina Ip, Martin Liao, Chen Chen Ying, Patrick, Jeffrey Lam, Ma Fong Kwok, Anne Chiang, Eunice Yong, Ben Chan, Lo Wai Kwok, abstention, none.
贊成嘅係8。
8 in favour, 11 against, so the motion has been rejected. So let's move on to item 3, development of a smart city. Let's invite the administration team to join us.
繼續，見到。而家見到有毛孟靜議員、楊岳橋議員、莫乃光議員、馬逢國議員、容海恩議員，係數錯。數啊，1、2，數1、2、3、4、5、6、邊個？呢個陳志全係同一個人嚟㗎。哦，係啊，7個。
Okay, 7. So wrong count. Raymond Chan was doubly counted. So 7 in favour.
係。
Sorry, speaker is not coming through. So it's 7 versus 11. 7 in favour, 11 against.
好，咁就
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nicholas Young, for attending our meeting. He's the new Secretary for Innovation and Technology. So this is an item on smart city development. Because the title shown on screen was wrong. Okay, which one is to speak first? So you can then defer to another colleague to walk us through the paper. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, the administration has been working hard to develop Hong Kong into a smart city through the use of information and communications technology to improve city management and development efficiency in order to address citizens' concerns and also to enhance Hong Kong as an attraction for talents and so on. So we have to go for innovation and so on. In September 2016, we commissioned a consultant to come up with a blueprint on the development of a smart city. And the scope of the study included strategy, development plan, and also governance plan, and also the framework, and also the opening up of data, and also public-private partnership. And we've taken reference from the experience elsewhere, and we've also talked to different stakeholders, including government policy bureaus and departments, and also public sector organizations, the academia, the laboratories, and also academic representatives, and also professional groups. And the consultant also set up a dedicated website to collect views on the development of Hong Kong into a smart city. By the end of June, the consultant submitted the study report to the government, and we have immediately uploaded the report to the OGCIO's website for public view. The consultant suggested that the software for Hong Kong to develop into a smart city, that is to popularize innovation and technology, and we should also develop an advanced community and economy so as to make Hong Kong a famous smart city. And also the blueprint involves smart mobility, smart living, smart environment, smart people, and smart government, as well as smart economy. So these are the 6 areas to be covered by the development program. And the consultant also looked at the short-term, mid-term, and also long-term development strategy. And there are also different targets to be met. And a series of measures and programs will be put in place in order to come up with the proper data framework in order to support the long-term development of a smart city, including the data infrastructure, and also the big data analytical ability, and enhancing cybersecurity, and also how to deal with open data and so on. In order to continue to open up our data, the government has also looked at the priority to be set up for opening up the data for public-private partnership. And also in coming up with the blueprint, the consultant also suggested that there should be certain pilot projects, for example, with regard to the adoption of a certain solution for smart city, and also an experimental community for smart city development. So we have to look at the different policy areas, and we will be looking at these with the relevant bureaus and departments. We will also be consulting the stakeholders and also the community in order to come up with a program that is in line with the needs of Hong Kong. Our target is that in the 3rd quarter of 2018, or before that, we will be announcing the program. Well, developing Hong Kong into a smart city is a challenging process. We need the community to work with us so that we can build a consensus before we can achieve those targets. So that's all for my opening statement, and I welcome members to comment on the report by the consultant, and both myself and my colleagues will be more than happy to take members' questions. Thank you. Okay. The floor is open, and I have Claudia Mo, Elvin Young, and so on. So have I missed out any names? Eunice Yong. Well, we have a tight schedule today. How about setting the speaking time at 4 minutes, including both questions and answers? All right, Claudia Mo. Thank you, Chairman. Well, smart city includes smart government. But then from what I've seen, in terms of your attitude towards a smart city, you're basically looking at data. I'd like to remind you that other than data, you must have heard about Mark Twain's lies, stems, lies, and statistics. So if you just look at data, it's not adequate, because for genuine smartness, well, you will have to look at something more. For example, for transport data, that's not available. That's totally undesirable. That's question number 1. And second, I'd like to clarify with you. Well, for personal privacy, you said that there would be a subject on this identification issue. So what does that mean? So what does that mean? Bureau Director, what does that mean? All right, the English version is anonymized. To anonymize the data, so you will turn it into anonymous data. Well, I find it difficult to understand. And the other issue is, so what's your question, Claudia Mo? Well, I was saying that you don't even have transport data, so how can you call yourself a smart city? Because it's not just about data. Well, for a genuinely smart city, it has to be an integrated society so that we can have a smart government. Bureau Director, I'll try to answer the question first, and then I'll see if the GCIO can have something to add. Well, for transport data, that will be covered in our study, but then we haven't spelled that out very clearly because by big data, we are actually talking about a lot of data. And for transport data, as you know, the current problem is that well, certain parties might not be prepared to disclose their data, and therefore we are thinking about how we can make sure that such data will be more publicly available. Well, will you be amending the legislation to mandate the disclosure of such information? Because there is something called public interest, right? Yes, Bureau Director, we have mentioned that time and again. So will you be considering amending the legislation requiring the parties to disclose such data? Well, since the motion debate, Bureau Director, can you speak up a little? Well, there was a motion debate on the proposal to amend the legislation, and we will deal with that very seriously, because the most important thing is that transport data will be part of it, but then that will have to be taken up by the relevant bureau. All right, you talk about seriously considering it, and also you'll be cautious about this and that. Well, can you be more serious about this? Can you give us a timetable, for example? Well, can you say by 2020 all our transport data will be made available to the public? That should be your target, right? Well, I think in terms of our data, a lot of things can be done. Well, transport data will be part of it. Well, there is one thing that I'm not able to give you a timetable on. It's not that we are not working on it at all. We are actually prepared to work on it. And we just talk about this, and we are still discussing it with the relevant bureau. And there are many ways to disclose the data. We don't necessarily have to go for legislation. But then the thing is, we will have to sort it out amongst ourselves, because we don't want to create other problems in the process of resolving this problem. Well, you should have included the English name in the Chinese version. Well, you should not have called it 去識別法. You should have said that you're just anonymizing it. So you won't be able to identify who is making those remarks. Well, the purpose is to make it clearer. Sorry, on this occasion, we might have omitted that, so we should have been more careful. Alvin Young? All right, no time for further follow-up. Alvin Young? Well, earlier on, Mrs. Carrie Lam said that where there has been a consensus amongst the various bureaus and departments, then she would be putting it before the newly reformed or newly set up policy coordinating group, so that that would be chaired by either her or the 3 top secretaries. So based on that idea, will the administration consider this? All right, under the consultant's proposal, it's proposed that there should be a high-level team led by the CS or the FS, so that there can be interdepartmental or cross-bureau collaboration on this, because you will have to set priorities, and the consultant has been proposing that there should be sharing of vehicles in order to increase the capacity of vehicles or private cars in carpooling. I think that would be very similar to the format of Uber. So will you be reviewing the relevant legislation so that that could also become the steering committee's first or top projects? Because earlier on the radio program, well, some people say that in a sharing community or economy, criticisms have been leveled against the relevant parties, and the administration is trying to promote the development of a smart city instead of becoming the commissioner for police. So you have spent several $1 million on this consultancy study report, and you should have the duty of making sure that it can be implemented in full, right? Bureau Director, well, all the recommendations by the consultant will be considered, including the proposed steering committee involving the top officials. And also in terms of reindustrialization and also on innovation and technology, well, that would already come under the steering committee, which is chaired by the financial secretary. So for all these initiatives, they will be pressed ahead. As to whether or not I would be in charge of law and order and security, well, no, I just set out the priorities and also the principles. So please do not misunderstand this, because in promoting a shared economy, well, please do not mix it up with the adoption of Uber and so on, because we absolutely in favor of the development of a shared economy.
Madam Chair, I would like to know, in dealing with the recommendations of the consultant report, will the Secretary come up with a timetable, undertake to realize the recommendations? Do you have a roadmap or a timeline? When we talk about innovation and technology, success lies in forging a consensus within the community. The first task that we want to do is to forge a consensus. If there is no consensus, there is no way that we can proceed. Second, there are some pilot projects recommended in this report. And for these pilot projects, I believe that we can take forward some of them immediately. We won't wait. Now, when we talk about consensus, the CUHK's public opinion poll found that 80% of the respondents support the government establishing a framework for sharing of vehicles. Does the Secretary consider this a kind of consensus? When I talk about consensus, I'm talking about consensus from all the stakeholders. We should not just rely on the results of a survey. Stakeholders, including the academia, all the stakeholders. Mr. Charles Mock. Madam Chair. Yes. Sorry, the speaker's not coming. Yes, we can hear you. Yes, okay. Madam Chair. On this consultant report, I have said many times that the government has conducted so many consultancy studies. What matters most is we should start working. I have brought along several consultancy study reports. 1314, IBM and OGCIC, Smarter Hong Kong Consultancy, 2015, the CPU, another report on Smart City, and then EKEO, 15 to 16 report, and now we have this report 16-17. So that's all right, but what I want to say is that among all the consultants' report, this one is the most comprehensive one. It also points out why the recommendations have not been implemented, because the laws are outdated. There is lack of coordination among the government departments. Now, you've come up with a number of suggestions, including setting up a high-level cross-departmental committee and also 6 pilot projects, etc. But what's most disappointing is that many of my peers have submitted a number of recommendations to the government on how to develop smart city. We have hosted so many discussion forums. And then this one is just a consultancy report for the blueprint. It's not the blueprint itself. Well, we have the misunderstanding that it should be a blueprint itself. And last Friday, I read through this, and it will be only in the 3rd quarter of 2018 that the blueprint will be released. So we have to wait for another year. Now, the Secretary said that the blueprint will be announced before the 3rd quarter of 2018, but in the report it's just the 3rd quarter of 2018. So that's a step forward. Now, in the past couple of days, I've talked to the secretary and also some other bureau directors and also the FS. I have also mentioned this. Can things be done in parallel? Maybe you would need time to draft the blueprint, but at the same time, can you start the pilot projects earlier at the same time? So, Secretary and also the AGCIO, can you work on something first without having to wait, say, for the blueprint to be announced in the third quarter of 2018? We will be further lagging behind if that is the case. I will say something first before I ask the AGCIO to say something further. I think what's most important is we should forge a consensus. You say that we should do things in parallel, then I'll defer it to the GCIO. Mr. Young. The consultant's report has made a number of proposals. In fact, the government has started on some of the work for the Development Bureau together with the working groups and other relevant bureaus and departments, including the OGCIO. And we are already working on the Common Spatial Data Infrastructure. And that is to set up some database and all those standards so that in the future, government departments can make use of this CSDI. They know exactly the facilities above ground and below ground so that they can take forward their projects accordingly. So that's one thing. Another thing that we're working on is Wi-Fi connectivity city, and that is being undertaken by GCIO. And also for the public sector information portal, we are now improving the data interface and application programs, and in the middle of this year, 1,000 programs or applications have been launched. Well, just one further comment. Well, you've been talking about these all the time, and they have not been completed. But now we're asking you what brand new projects you're going to take forward, and you are repeating all these projects once again. So the industry is really disappointed. Mr. Ma Fung Kwok. Thank you, Madam Chair. The report has now been made public. You said that you would try out certain projects, but I got the feeling that we are falling far behind our neighboring cities. Well, we are lagging behind all cities on the mainland. And for other cities, they've been able to do certain things, for example, in visiting museums and tourist spots, and they can really, through some scanning, they can listen to all the narration in relation to the guided tours. So when we talk about the digital payment, we are still lagging behind because people are not very easy about the security problems and so on. The worries are not eased. So can the government expedite things? And for, say, the cultural and tourist sports, can you do something immediately without involving certain substantial changes in certain systems? Can you take forward your work step by step? Because we are lagging far behind. Lagging behind too much. You've been discussing these initiatives all the time, but nothing is being done speedily. We are lagging behind, Secretary. Digital payment. Well, digital payment is mainly done via credit card in Hong Kong. And no cash is involved in this digital payment method in Hong Kong. In the mainland, then they use the debit card. You have to have the cash deposit before you can use the debit card. And in fact, Hong Kong is lagging behind. And the HKMA has issued 13 to 16 licenses in that regard. And for these new companies, they are now starting their business, trying to promote the business. And I don't think Hong Kong will be lagging behind too much. We'll be able to catch up very fast. And as for the visitors, the cultural sports and museums and so on, I don't have much information on hand, and I can't make a response there. The consultant's report contains a lot of recommendations. How will the government implement these recommendations, especially for those you have to work with the private organizations? What kind of strategies do you have to make sure that the private companies will work together with you? Now, if you look at the policy addressed this year, there is this program called Tech Connect. $500 million will be involved, and they are mainly for government departments. And the ITB will be earmarking certain resources to help government departments to overcome problems as far as technology is concerned. And we are committing certain resources. We'll try to help them connect or link up with private companies, which can then help them improve their services. And I believe that this can help various government departments. Now, you talk about government departments, but then some of the initiatives have to be launched out through the help of private companies, and they are services for the public. The government will commit resources, will work together with the private companies, and then we'll be able to address the problems. This is a good first step. In the past, when we asked government department to take on certain initiatives, they would tell you that they don't have the money. But we don't see this problem anymore because ITB will be giving them the money, and we will be helping them on all sides, including linking them up with the private companies. Next, Mr. Ronick Chan. Madam Chair, my first question similar to Mr. Ma's question. In paragraph 16, the government says that they need a PPP to develop a smart city. But then the government is being accused all the time by people about private government collusion. And for paragraph 17, it said that you would try to link up with SMEs to provide help to elderly homes. I think the government should think more about the cooperation model so that PPP can be implemented successfully. I agree that if the government only works on its own without the help of private companies, then I don't think we can achieve much. And will the government consider how that PPP can work and at the same time you not be accused of having private sector, public sector collusion? We visited Austria. We studied their situation. Austria is a very small country. They speak German mainly, and they've been very successful in, well, I don't know how to put it in Chinese, consortium of SMEs. And say several hundred SMEs will band together and then form this consortium. And then a few of these SMEs will be identified which have the capability to help with the government, and it will be the government for the government to pick these SMEs. I think that's a fairer approach. We'll try to lessen the risk of private-public collusion. Madam Chair, maybe that can be one direction. I hope that the government, in the next stage, when you announce a blueprint, please try to take reference from overseas practices to make sure that the PPP can really be working. And also, for the consultant's report, they mentioned about several smart initiatives: smart mobility, living, environment, people, government, economy, etc. But we need long-term planning for some of them. For example, smart government, you said that for the drainage, sewage system, rainwater harvesting, then they can be linked together. So if with the planning and the implementation will take a very long time. But for other parts, for example, smart mobility, smart people, well, they may be just be about enhancing existing services. And they also mentioned about short, medium, and long-term measures. For example, 2017, 21 to 25, and 2030, respectively. So which initiatives are considered, say, short-term initiatives, which are mid-term, which are long-term? So before the blueprint is announced, please try to match the initiatives against the short-term, mid-term, and long-term period that you are proposing, so that we can have a basic concept as to exactly which measures can be implemented, say, in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. Maybe, say, for smart government initiatives like linking up the various underground utilities. That may take a longer time. That may be one of the long-term measure, right? So can the Secretary elaborate? Now, if you look at the different policy bureaus, they may be working on long-term measures now, but you may be asking about what are the short-term and mid-term measures. Can I ask the PS to elaborate? For the 6 smart areas, actually, the short, medium, and long-term measures have been listed out. That may span a total of 13 years, but actually most of the initiatives will be completed in the short and medium term. And in the long-term period, well, some of the initiatives will be fully completed. So you are setting out all the short, mid, and long-term measures in the different paragraphs. Can you give us a separate table listing out, say, the initiatives for the different terms? Can you give us a table in writing later on? Dr. N. Chang. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's good to have a broad direction here. The ITB, after all, has been established for just over 1 year. But at least we are seeing this blueprint direction. It's better late than never, of course.
But the most important thing is, while we are developing ourselves into a smart city, I think the most important thing is to provide convenience to the public so as to enhance their quality of living. So we need to ensure that the community at large fully understands what you're doing. I think the public does have a problem in understanding what you mean by smart city. So in the consultant's report, it's proposed that there would be certain pilot projects, including the smart public transport terminus, and also the smart poles, and also smart traffic lights, and also smart parking space search, and so on. Well, all these have to do with people's daily life. In particular, they have to do with transport. So I'll be giving you more time. So can you tell us exactly what does that mean? What kind of concept is that? Yes, Bureau Director. I think it's more appropriate to defer it to the consultant. Okay, Mr. Wong. So on the first 4 points, yes, Ms. Chiang. On the first 4 points, the first is developing the intelligent transport interchange, so that for people or passenger waiting for public transport, more information can be provided to them so that they can make a smart choice. And what we have in mind is that at the interchange, for example, for certain bus routes, as to the capacity, how full the buses are, and also what's the weather like, and also what alternative mode of transport is available. So that will have to be citizen-centered, and the information should be provided to them so that they can make the best choice in terms of transport arrangement. Next is about the multifunction poles. Well, in various smart cities, they would have sensors all around, and then in the poles, we can have different sensors installed in order to support government's work in terms of collection of data. So that would also support government's study and collection of data, and also, well, on the provision of 5D signals that could also be implemented through these poles. And also on traffic signaling, we hope to apply technology to help both the transport and also the passengers to reduce the waiting time. So we can make use of different data. In particular, well, during daytime and also during rush hours, if we can provide information through the sensors so that the traffic lights can also switch the different lighting at different times to suit the traffic conditions on the ground. And also for parking, we are basically talking about car parks, and very often we can see that vehicles might be waiting on street for an off-street parking space, and that would be blocking the traffic, and that would also cause air pollution. So if we are able to provide more information to the motorists, then number one, they can decide if they want to drive, and second, which car park they'd like to go, because they know whether or not parking spaces are still available. Ms. Chiang, I hope that in developing this, you will really be focusing on areas where members of the public will indeed be able to feel or benefit. So I hope that the pilot projects would be more generalized and popularized so that members of the public will find it easier to understand. All right, next, Lo Wai Kwok. Thank you, Madam Chair. The report covers a wide spectrum of issues because the consultant has come up with this blueprint, and as some members have said, there are different areas: smart mobility, smart living, smart environment, smart people, smart government, and smart economy. The direction is right. But then it's the government which will be able to take the lead. So I think the easiest thing to go for would be smart government, but then I would find it lamentable. All right, we're talking about BRN and also 5G, but then even when the administration is trying to increase the number of Wi-Fi hotspots so that the coverage of Wi-Fi can be broadened, well, it will take up to 3 years to do this. So if that is the speed of how you can go about this, then definitely you will be lagging behind. So what I'd like to say is, does the government have any plan to expedite the whole thing so that you'll be able to achieve those targets earlier? For example, for BRN, well, in the construction sector, we have been doing that already. So that's the BIM model. But then for big data, you will have to use it. It's not just about buildings design and repair and maintenance. Well, throughout the life cycle of these buildings, if you're able to use BIM, then that would mean a world's difference. If you're just doing it at your own pace, then we'll be lagging behind. Next, I'd like the Bureau Director to clarify this, because all along we've been talking about Kowloon East as a pilot point for the development of a smart city, but then the consultant apparently is talking about the entire territory. So what's the relationship between this and Kowloon East? Will you really be able to do it in Kowloon East so that some of these objectives for smart city, whether it's hardware and software, when can that be done in Kowloon East? Well, I'll try to answer the question in different levels. First, for 5G, all right, the target date is 2020. So we are just 3 years before the rolling out of 5G. So it will still have to be done via antennas, and that can be done hand in hand with our Wi-Fi program. We hope to be able to do it in 3 years, and of course we'd like to expedite that. But then for Wi-Fi plus, well, the target is the same as that for 5G, and also for BIN. I have no qualms about that at all. But then it's about how we can roll that out so that the entire construction sector will be prepared to adopt it, and also whether the Hong Kong government can include that as a prerequisite for them to adopt. And we are still talking to the Development Bureau on that. Well, for Kowloon East, it's a district-based project, but then on this occasion, we are talking about something different. If you look at the pilot projects, well, they can be implemented in Kowloon East, and we have been discussing with the consultant in detail. So when we discuss the overall directions, we also have to bear in mind that certain pilot programs can go first in Kowloon East. Yes, Chairman, I think my time is almost up, but still, I'd like to be more specific about Kowloon East. Can you have an action plan so that we can know it more specifically? If that's the pilot project, then we'd like to know the actual action plan. Okay, next, Eunice Yung. Yes, development of a smart city would definitely be the way to go for Hong Kong. We can see that in terms of our technology preparation or readiness, well, there are several things that the administration will have to do. For example, department's readiness will have to be enhanced. And also in terms of our data framework, we're talking about big data. We have to collect big data, and definitely that has to be done by the government because the private sector simply will not be able to do it. And under big data, you have personal privacy. So I think you can't say that I'm collecting private or personal data, and on the other hand, I'm not going to infringe upon personal privacy. So that's hard to achieve. And you also need to set up the sensor and also the hardware processing device. So which department will be able to deal with that? And also what about the legal issues and also the technology issue? And the second question is, if we were to enhance the local talent so that they can be involved in the development of smart city, how are you going to achieve that? Bureau Director. I'll defer to the GCIO. Well, for the Smart City Development Office or the Smart City Program Office, it depends on what data we are collecting, whether or not it would involve personal data. For example, if we just collect data about temperature, weather, and also transport or traffic flow, that would not involve the collection of any personal data. At the same time, we can also have a video camera, and there is a chance that we might be able to see people on camera. And of course, we can always do something to mask the identity of the individuals. For example, we can adopt the identification technology to avoid collecting personal data. And as we have said, for big data and personal privacy, these are things that have to be dealt with by way of building a consensus in a community. For example, under what circumstances, what personal data can be collected. There needs to be a consensus within the community on this. And after achieving consensus, then we can gradually collect more data. So I think that would take a consultation exercise before we can arrive at a consensus. Next, about the steering committee on smart city. What's the direction that is to be taken, and also is it feasible for you to cover such a broad area involving so many bureaus and departments? Because if you want them to make policy and they will have to be responsible for monitoring the implementation, then will this steering committee be able to do so many things? Ms. Young, your question is very good. It's indeed very challenging. But then for all the problems involving a smart city, definitely it will involve different policy bureaus and departments. So that's something that the administration will have to face up to. And indeed, the chief executive has always pledged that she would devote a lot of attention to this. With her attention and with the recent discussions that have taken place amongst the bureaus, the response has been very positive. We all want to do it. And in terms of resources, indeed, that will be a problem. But then we have already got some resources. Well, as you are aware, the FS has already set aside some reserve for us, and whatever needs to be used will be used. So we have already rolled out some of the programs, and once we can see some effect, I'm sure the departments will be more energetic in rolling out further programs. Mr. Frankie Yik, first of all, I welcome this consultant report. Well, Bureau Director, I still have not got the time to go through the entire report, but then as I've heard, well, you talk about smart Wi-Fi. Well, when can we have Wi-Fi throughout the city? I think that's a very positive infrastructure. Or else, why bother to talk about moving towards higher innovation and technology? And you also want to set up a central platform so that you can reuse and also share the resources. I welcome that, and I hope that that can be done as soon as possible, because I've been citing these examples. Well, whoever has a driver's license, when you ask them when will your license expire, well, very few people can tell you. So very often they will have to wait until the very last minute or until after they received a demand note for late payment. So as a smart government, you should provide convenience to the public, because I don't want to break the law. And if you're able to send out more information to the public, then that would only be good. Next, I've also heard some members say that, as you've mentioned in your paper, well, on transport, you're going to promote the sharing of private cars in order to increase the capacity of private cars. So are you talking about the concept of carpooling? So can the consultant clarify this? Or are you saying that, well, at present, well, for vehicles that are taking on passengers for payment, so that's illegal. So are you encouraging that? Well, Bureau Director, yes, thank you for your question. Well, just now we talked about the development of big data. That's correct, because when the data can be formatted in such a way that they can be processed in tandem, then that would facilitate sharing of such data. That's a very important part.
That's a very important change. You talk about the sharing of vehicles. There are many different ways of doing it. Carpooling is one, but I must stress that I hope that this can be done legally. If we're trying to challenge the rule of law, which is a core value in Hong Kong, then that's not allowed. And even if there is a benefits out of this shared economy model, then that would not be good. We're not just having carpooling. We must have other approaches. And we must not rely on just one business model. And we must operate everything legally. When we talk about sharing of resources, of course, I support that. We can make use of ICT and achieve that, and that's something good, and I support it. But we have to be mindful of the legislation, and we have to strike a balance. Now, for the mobile car hailing service is not state-of-the-art technology. It's very common, actually, these days. So I agree that we should share resources within the community. But we have to look at the actual situation. We should have fair competition. The consultant, do you have anything to add on top of what the Secretary said? Consultant, what the Secretary said is correct. We will maybe have, say, more passengers sharing the same vehicle. It's not profit-making, right? Well, that's good. Mr. Raymond Chan, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to follow up on smart government. I think that can be done the soonest, because it will be spearheaded by the government. Some fellow members have mentioned this, and I want to say something more. Now, for this smart government, there is this office, multifunctional smart polls to help the government support the governance. And then the GCIO talked about the smart poles using for collecting data on temperature and so on. But if you just have temperature information gathering, that's really disappointing. But what is the information that can be collected by the smart poles, which can help the government with implementation of its policies? And does it fall into this, say, short, medium, or long term? I have really identified certain locations for you for that. Some telephone booths are going to be demolished.
because no people are using it. So I think the telephone booths are good locations for you to install these smart poles. Less department meant these locations to be used for telephone booths, but can you resume these locations and install smart poles there? I think if you can do that, then that shows that you can really do something, remove the hurdles immediately. Can you use the telephone booths for putting up smart poles? Yes, that can definitely be considered. The telephone booths can be a good location. Let me tell you the benefits of the smart poles. And there are several concepts to it. First, for the smart poles, they can be scattered everywhere. They may be placed several 100 meters apart. So for Wi-Fi spots, they also are separated by a distance of 100 meters or so. And if we talk about launching 5G in the future, then the smart poles can be used for 5G purposes. And the 5G function can help improve the efficiency in our communications. So that's my simple reply. Can you give me some specific examples on how you would, what measures you would put in place to build a smart government? Wi-Fi is a wireless type of telecommunication. It can support transmission of big data over, say, 1 gig. So that will be a high-speed connection within the city as a result. And the government can gather data very speedily through 5G. Say if you have a car accident, or you need to call an ambulance, then the ambulance can quickly locate you if we have that kind of technology. So that kind of public services can be provided. And we will be able to know exactly where there is traffic jam. And then if that is the case, then ambulances can choose the quickest route to get to a place. If that kind of information is available. I will be the last one to ask a question before we go to the next item. Secretary, we've been waiting for this for a long time, and the sector has been talking about smart city all the time, and we want it to be implemented as soon as possible. This report is a rather detailed and comprehensive report, and for the initiatives mentioned here that they can be discussed in detail. I hope that there will be opportunities for us to do so in the future. But many of the members here said that we will have to wait till 2018 before there is implementation. We still have to consult on this report, and this is very slow, and this is not what we expect, the kind of speed that we are expecting coming from the government. You talk about pilot projects, and you said that you would conduct something or do something at the central Old Town area. But for other initiatives like those related to transport and also for the smart poles, these are cross-departmental initiatives. And you haven't even set up the steering committee. So we are very worried that whether these pilot projects can be implemented as soon as possible. Can you give a timetable to us showing exactly when the pilot projects will start and when they will end? Do we have to wait till Q3 of 2018 before we can take forward these pilot projects? Well, for some of the projects that where they have commenced, but for the overall blueprint, when can that be implemented? Madam Chair, I think you've asked a very good question. We are not consulting. Again, we're trying to build a consensus on the recommendations. I'm not asking for your ideas in the consultation to be launched. Now the consultant's report has been released, And we are asking you how you will set the priorities on these recommendations. We'll consult all government departments and stakeholders. That's number one. Number two, we will not wait till later before we implement the pilot projects. Those will go first. And after the consultation, we will give you a timetable as soon as possible. But we still have to discuss all these initiatives first. Now, for those ongoing projects, and you say that they don't seem to be very important because they're ongoing. But for the blueprint, what matters most is all the initiatives have to be interconnected. So the ongoing measures form part of the smart city blueprint, and we have to connect or link up all these different initiatives and measures. And for the steering committee on smart city, I've got the instruction that I should draft the terms of reference as soon as possible so that we can set up this steering committee soonest. I'm under pressure to do that. So, Secretary, so for the upcoming consultation, you will be seeking the views, say, of the various government departments. Say we want to work on so many transport initiatives. You will ask them for priorities to be given to you, right? And after the discussion, then you will have the priority list for short, medium, and long term. And then after that, you will be able to give us a timeline and also the overall budget, right? Is that the case? Yes, the steering committee will be working on that. One thing that I would like to stress, the world over, we don't have an international set of standards for world smart cities. We have ISO 37122, which are being discussed, and the discussion will finish, say, in 1 year's time. And that standards will apply to all cities in the world, and there will be a set of KPIs launched, and then we can compare one smart city with another using a very objective set of standards then. Well, thank you very much, Secretary. I hope that we can implement the smart city and we can overtake others in that regard. Okay. Item 4 is a review on the regulation of person-to-person telemarketing calls. So now I would like to invite the administration team in. Those members who wish to speak, please raise their hands. Ronnie Chan, Chen Chi-chun, Lam Kwok Hong. Anyone else? Okay. First of all, well, welcome the new Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development, Mr. Awad Yao, who is attending the meeting for the first time. So which official will take us through this item? I will say something by way of introduction, and then I'll ask my colleague to take you through the paper. Madam Chair, members, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to discuss this paper with you today. And this is the first meeting with the members in my new position. And in the days ahead, I look forward to good exchanges with you on issues of information technology and broadcasting. Now, this paper is about person-to-P2P telemarketing calls. In the past couple of weeks, I have met with individual members and political parties, and I know that in the past few years you have given us a lot of views on this matter, and members of the public are very concerned about this kind of marketing calls. So against this background, we are having this consultation paper, and the consultation period will last till the end of this month. And after this consultation exercise, we will see the way forward, map out the way forward. We have 3 major directions: self-regulatory by the sector, and also maybe legislating, so that those who don't want to take such calls can will no longer receive such calls. We have proposed three models, and these three models are not conflicting each other. And if needed, we can proceed with all of them. But in Chapter 3, we said that we have to be mindful of the effectiveness of whatever measure we go for. Say, if we want to legislate the third approach, we will have to bear in mind whether this approach is feasible, effective, and how to prevent people circumventing the regulation. And of course, there may be unscrupulous telemarketing calls. People are repugnant to that. But then in the business sector, this is a way of promotion, and a lot of jobs are really provided by the sector. So we have to consider that as well. So under that premise, we hope that members of the public can give us more views, and the consultation will last till the end of this month. And up to today, actually, we haven't received many views. So I would like to appeal here that members can give us their views. Is it Mr. Lee who will take us through the paper? Yes, please. Yes, now I would like to talk about the strengthening the regulation of P2P telemarketing calls on the content of the consultation paper. There are 4 chapters. Well, let's look at them one by one. One is the current situation in Hong Kong. There are 3 types of situation. There are 4 sectors which make the most calls: finance, insurance, telecommunications, and call centers. They have joined a self-regulatory scheme, and specifically, these trade associations have issued industry-specific codes of practice to their members, including, say, they should make calls at designated hours. They cannot do it too early or too late in the day, and they should show the telemarketer's phone number. And if the other party requests for unsubscribing to the calls, and they have to, such requests have to be complied with.
Back in 2013, the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance was amended, which provides that unless you've already got the subject's consent, you cannot use his personal data for any direct marketing activity, including P2P calls. Thirdly, for unsolicited electronic messages ordinance, which came into effect in 2007, and that covers facsimile and also pre-recorded messages. Well, there was certain regulation about those. And then back in 2015, in order to understand a bit better about the public's views about these direct marketing or telemarketing services, well, the survey result was that some 96% of the respondents felt that such calls would cause nuisance, and also 67% of the respondents were inclined to adopting a legislative approach in dealing with such problems. With regard to the callers, some 70% felt that they should be dealt with by way of legislation. And as the Bureau Director just said, at present, there are a number of employees working for the industry, and according to our survey, some 7,000 people are working in the sector. And in Chapter 2 of the paper, we look at the experience elsewhere. We notice that, well, the more prevailing regulation would be to adopt a do not call register. In other words, the members of the public, of the community, can register their phone numbers with this register, and then the companies or telemarketers will not be allowed to make calls to these persons to do direct marketing. But then we have seen that there are also different regulators. Some would be related to telecommunications, some would be related to protection of consumers, and so on. And in these jurisdictions, when it comes to enforcement, the general practice is that the companies would try to circumvent that by way of technology. For example, they will change the phone number being displayed, and also through they would also try to use a voice over internet protocol, or to mask the calls from other jurisdictions, and so on. And in Chapter 3 of the consultation paper, we also look at the general principles for consideration, and that would also mean that the regime should be effective in reducing the nuisance to the recipients, and that should also be enforceable, and that should also be flexible enough, and the regime should also not impose onerous burden on normal business operations. And under these principles in Chapter 4, we discuss these three possible options. First, there would be more self-discipline. Either we extend the current practice to other trades. For example, we can also have complaint processing procedures to help members of the public to lodge complaints, and also we'll be publicizing the number of complaints in order to enhance the transparency and make it more effective. Second, we would also encourage more members of the public to use phone filtering apps. We can work with the software companies, and also we can also fund the research on this, and we can also adopt a more stringent criteria in addressing members of the public's concern about privacy protection, so that we can encourage the more extensive use of such apps. And fourthly, we can also implement the do not call register, so that the recipients can also register their phone numbers with the apps, and then the telemarketers will not be allowed to use those phone numbers for telemarketing purposes. So one is a non-legislative approach and the other is a legislative approach, and Chapter 5 discuss the pros and cons of both approaches. And for the non-legislative approach, that can be implemented more shortly, and it would be more flexible, and the compliance cost for the trade would be lower, and the impact would also be less severe. But then the cons is that it would depend on whether or not the industries would be prepared to accept such a non-statutory approach. But then with a legislative approach, that would achieve a better deterrent effect, and that would also give the public greater confidence, and that would also apply to different industries, and that would also foster equal competition amongst the various industries. But then in terms of enforcement, there would be difficulties, for example, collection of evidence, and also there would be circumvention technologies. For example, they could also mask the color display and so on, and that would render law enforcement very difficult. And last but not least, in the last chapter, we try to summarize the views. We would welcome members' views, and we would like to listen to the public's views before the end of the consultation period. Okay. Chen Chen-ying, Chi-fung, Charles Mock, Alvin Young, Xiu Ka-fei. Anyone else? Okay, 4 minutes, including both questions and answers. Chen Chen-ying, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that I agree with the principles set up by the administration in determining which option would be adopted to regulate P2P calls. But then for the three options that have been set up, I have some questions. First, self-discipline by the trades. All right, in 2010, we already put in place these codes, and different chambers of commerce have also got some self-regulation codes and so on. Since the introduction of these codes, for the four main trades, how many complaints have they received? And also for the complaint mechanism, how many cases have been followed up on, and has penalty been meted out? So have you got the data? Second, on call filtering devices or apps, I don't think that would help resolve the problem, because for some groups in a community like elders and so on, they simply do not have smart devices. So how can you expect them to be able to download such apps? In particular for singleton elders, they've been receiving such telemarketing calls. So what do you expect them to do? So that's the second question. Third, on legislative approach to regulate such practices, well, for example, if they mask their calls so that they can pretend to have a call from overseas jurisdictions and so on. So what can be done about it? And different trades, there are also different practices and situations. Apparently, the administration is suggesting that, all right, you're going to adopt the do not call register, and so they can refuse all the calls, or they do not have to do so. But then what if they just want to receive some calls but not all? For example, for fitness and also for beauty salons, all right, they will be prepared to accept those calls, but for the lending institutions calls, they don't want them. So would there be difficulties for people to opt in and opt out? Why is it that they only have two choices, either take it or leave it? Yes, Permanent Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair. On the questions raised by Mr. Chen, I'll try to answer them first. Well, since 2011, since the rolling out of the self-regulatory practice, well, according to the different trades, they've given us the figures. I have to emphasize that these figures have been reported by them. It's not the administration that has collected such data. Okay, according to the report for complaints figures, well, in 2011 and 12, 1,219, and then by 2015-16, that came down to 798. So in terms of the figures, we could see that there is a downward trend. And after introducing this self-regulatory practice, well, by 2014 May, there have been some improvements by the financial sector. For example, they will have to give the name of their company and also the proper telephone number so that the recipient may call back to the alleged bank to find out if the caller was indeed from that particular bank and so on. So that's the self-regulatory regime. That's the banking, insurance, telecommunication, and call center. So altogether, some 6 unions joined this self-regulatory regime. As to the penalty, up till now, we have not received any statistics from them as to what sanctions have been meted out. But then, after we have invited them to introduce such a self-regulatory regime, for example, they should not be calling the recipients during the ungodly hours. Well, they've already done so. And then the second point is about elders or those who do not have a smart device. Well, what can be done about it? Well, that's precisely what we have been suggesting. That is, if members of the public think that option 2, that is, if software can help them filter the calls, then we can think about it. We can do some publicity and education. We can even invite some software companies to come up with software or apps to help those who might not be very familiar with using such smart devices. Sorry, you have overrun on your time already. For the remaining 2 questions, we'll be asking for further follow-up later. Next, Chi-fung. Thank you, Madam Chair. When P2P telemarketing calls are causing nuisance to the recipients, and when it's under the CEDB, then I would be very worried, because you would just be looking at it from the angle of commerce and economy. You will not be prepared to understand the sentiments of the public. They are subject to a lot of nuisance, and they find it very annoying. As you can see from the figures, well, the message has been loud and clear. Overwhelming majority of the respondents want legislation, and some 90% said that there was nuisance brought to them, and some 67% said that they would reject the calls, and 30% said that they would immediately hang up. So I think the figures are more than clear. That is, the current approach has not been effective. And then you conducted another round of consultation, but then I think it has taken far too long. All right, in 2011 you introduced the self-regulatory regime, and now it's 2017. Since you started to look into the issue, it has taken you 7-8 years, and yet it has not been effective at all. So in simple terms, you have failed. Okay, you talk about smart apps. Well, even I do not know how to use it. So I think the message is clear. You will have to introduce legislation before you can do it effectively. All right, despite the fact that the figures have, the statistics of complaints have come down, but then even the trade or the industries know very well that the past measures have not been very effective. So it's time to come up with legislation. We have got an example. That is, during the hospital did try to call up the patient's family, and then they called 3 times, and yet nobody was prepared to answer the call. And as a result of that, the operation was delayed. So how are you going to quantify that? Because of the nuisance caused by this industry, and as a result of that, there might have been some economic loss. Are you able to quantify that? And secondly, do you have cases so that even if there is legislation, they would simply be doing it together with another company? For example, if my bank calls me up, and if somebody else asks it to market other products for them, then what can I do? So have you considered that? Thank you for the questions. Well, the administration understands that the current practice, by nature, is marketing. So if the industry has done it properly, in other words, they have not abused the situation so much so that they are causing nuisance, then in a commercial society, that should be permitted. As Mr. Hui mentioned, precisely because of what has been done. Well, in some industries, they might have overdone it. As a result of that, on the one hand, they might have caused some nuisance, and on the other, that might have resulted in the recipients refusing to take the calls because of the nuisance. So we can see that, and that's precisely why in this consultation we'll be prepared to look into different directions or options. That is, well, we can also come up with an across-the-board approach. So we will apply the do not call register, and then no call would be allowed. Well, yes, there might be difficulties because in some trades, because of this irregularity, in fact, the industry itself would also be hurt, because they might have wanted to make a call to market certain products or services, but then if they are not doing it properly, then it might be counterproductive, and that would also be there would also be a social cost, as you have said. But then I also have the duty to point out that when we come up with a way to tackle the problem, we also have to make sure that number one, is it effective, and number two, the purpose is to send out the correct message or a positive message instead of just stifling the practice altogether. All right, we are not able to extend the meeting any further, and we still have many members on the queue, so I'll have to draw a line, and then nobody would be allowed to join in, and then we will have to cut your question by 4 minutes. Charles Mark.
The greatest problem with with this consultation report is that you are mixing up the warm cause with the cold cause. You said that 7,000 people in the trade will be affected, but then for most of the local employees, they are having warm cause, definitely. But then some people said that they have had enough. And when I bring along this placard into the room, some fellow members said that we have had enough, and that is the sentiment for members of the public in general as well. You mentioned about these four centers: finance, insurance, telecommunications, and call center. What about the beauty sector? What about the money lenders? The money lenders don't belong to any of these sectors. For those people making warm calls, they said that you are regulating the good guys. They are already subject to the personal data privacy ordinance now, and if they opt out and they still call them, then they were subject to arrests. But then for those cold calls, they are not being regulated. Now, you've got the three options. The two options are now in use, and it shows that they are not deterrent enough. And the do not call register is a rather passive approach. We have to call in to say that we do not want to receive the calls. Can you add in more core options, say adding in assigning specific prefixes to telemarketers? Now, if the cold calling companies follow these practice, then they can be, say, regulated under this approach. Now, for those who don't want to follow this regulation, then you can do a covert operation and try to arrest them. The question is, the do not call registers have not been effective. You've not arrested people. You've not taken out prosecutions who are breaching the do not call register requirements. So what I'm asking you now is that in your consultation, will you consider other options on top of the three that you propose? These three options, if you do them all, you will still not be able to resolve the problem. Madam Cham, I have come up with this as generator as stop spam call. Now, members of the public can go to this website of mine to give their opinions. Would you consider exploring other options that I mentioned? Thank you.
with regard to cold-warm calls, to our understanding, well, these concepts are only known to those in the trade, but for members of the public, they are not familiar with such concepts. In accordance with the 2015 survey, we know that of the 800 respondents, around half of them said that among the calls they received, over 40% said that the callers could actually know about their personal information. Well, we welcome all sorts of suggestions. Mr. Raymond Chan. The government says in its paper that 86% of them said that they should call to person-to-person calls should be regulated, and 70% said that we should do it by way of legislation. For those who have been called by these P2P calls, they normally don't take calls without caller display, and some of them don't even take calls with caller display, but with telephone number not familiar to them. Now, in paragraph 6 of the paper, you said that you are concerned about the impact on SMEs and consultation has to be conducted. And Mr. Grexo said the same. You want to make sure that these SMEs can transform themselves and people are given the jobs before you consider legislation. Is that the approach? I support Mr. Charles Mark in using this template to ask people to give their views. Do you want members of the public to call you to tell them directly their requests? Many members have said that the approaches that you propose, including self-regulatory regime, etc., if it has worked, it has already worked. But that's not the case. And you also mentioned about call filtering apps and smartphones, and it's not very effective either, we think. Is it the case that the government doesn't want to do anything at all? If you talk about legislation, that's going to be a very important exercise. But so far from what I've heard from members is that when 70% of people are supporting legislation, the government should do it. Should the government wait till 100% of people are supportive of legislation before you are willing to do it? Now, the end of the consultation period is imminent. Do you want us to collect signature or petition for you or what? How come that the government has not been able to make a decision after all these discussions? I think legislation is a fair approach. We have been procrastinating, and even this today we are still talking about studying into legislation, and it will be another 2 years before really there is legislation. I don't think it's not difficult, say, for the SMEs or the trade to transform and turn to do some other business. If we compare that against, say, the loss suffered by people because of all these nuisance calls and so on, then I think we should do it. This is something that we have to be mindful of. Okay, government, well, the administration, please tell us exactly say the numbers of opinions or comments that you would receive before you are willing to do anything. We said that we have received only 100 submissions to date. That's a lot less than I originally thought. We do not focus on the numbers, of course, of submissions, but when we talk about a certain measure, we have to be mindful of the impact on various sides. But as I stress, we propose 3 options. They're not contradicting each other or conflicting each other, and it's not that we would have to wait till the very end before we do it. Actually, option 1 and option 2 are ongoing. Well, we will be listening to all the views up to the end of this year before we make a decision. Up to the end of this month, rather, before we make a decision. Well, if you attach importance to a certain thing, you would definitely come up with measures. We've discussed the options that you floated for 2 years, and they are found to be ineffective. So what kind of views do you expect before you want to do anything? Should I ask people to call you up every day? How many members of the public do you want to call you? Well, our people are following this debate live. Maybe we can appeal to them to call you up. Edward Yao, do you want to receive such warm calls or hot calls? These are hot calls. Well, if you ask the CDB to work on it, I don't think they can do it, because you will be very mindful about the business and commercial factors. You would be very careful in your approach. So there is just a 0.1% of impact on the business, then you would not do it. Your mission really is not to help members of the public and help them uphold their privacy. CDB is not there to work on this. What you want to do is that no excessive harm will be done to personal privacy. Of course, the stakeholders will tell you that it wouldn't be harmful, it would hurt their business, people will go out of job, etc. Come on. For whatever measure you put in place, certain people are bound to be suffering, and you have to strike a balance. And also we have telephone scams. And if you don't deal with the problem will only deteriorate. You spend a lot to work on smart city and so on. How come that you won't be able to tackle this problem? Well, Secretary, let's sign a contract. If you do it immediately, say 3 years later, if people say they can't find a job, they couldn't sell their goods, and their business suffers and so on. Well, we've come to a critical point or tipping point. We have to make a decision. Maybe Edward Yao is wrong, Elizabeth Quat is wrong, Leung Kwok Hong is wrong, but then we still have to make a decision. The entire electrical backs you up now. Even with that, you dare not proceed further. Mr. Peter Shiu said that he would not support it, then his voters would support him. This is very much a political process, I would say. You must have the stamina to deal with this kind of situation. Of course, there will be opposition. Well, if you go on like this, I'll be asking people to make hot calls to you. Call up Edward Yao, call up CEDB, call up all the government departments to tell them that we don't want such telephone nuisance. Ms. Claudia Mo, I have drawn a line because I have to hand over the room for a 3-hour meeting at 4:30. Sorry. Mr. Alvin Young, Madam Chair, I would like to follow up on Mr. Charles Mok's point. For these 3 options proposed by the government, it seems that in relation to the hot calls and the cold calls, well, your 3 options are dealing with these 2 types of calls together. So will the government try to separate the 2 types of calls in dealing with the situation? That's point number 1. Number 2, will there be any sort of pre-assigned telephone numbers, say a prefix to a telephone number, say number 4? You don't need to give say, for example, 400, 4000. So we are talking about, say 10,000 telephone numbers only. Is it possible, is it feasible, assigning specific privileges to telemarketers? If this is feasible, can you consider it? If this is not feasible, what are the difficulties? We try to think of solutions together with you. Yes. Mr. Mock and Mr. Young asked whether we would deal with whole cold calls and warm calls separately. And we understand the members' comments, and by the end of this month, we will have received all the views. And if we decide to go by legislation, setting up a do not call register, then we will think about we should be separately dealing with the two types of calls, whether there will be exemptions. If exemption is given to warm calls under the PDPO, it is already said that if you have a relationship with a client already, and if you have the personal information and he agrees to your use of information, then warm calls are allowed. So this is allowed already. Now, if we decide to go forward by way of legislation, should we be following the PDPO and grant certain exemptions? That can be a discussion that can be discussed at the next stage. Now, if you referred to assigning prefixes 41, 42, etc. to telephone numbers. Now, to date, not many members of the public support that idea, using prefixes to telephone numbers. We've asked the RTHK, if we want to use 41, then we will be actually holding 10,000 telephone numbers already.
And you can't really force the companies to get those numbers, and therefore the process would take quite a long time to implement. Of course, we are not ruling out any options. We will continue to listen to your views. But then what I'd like to say is, apparently, well, even members of the public are of the view that by assigning certain numbers to these companies, that might not work. Well, the fact that the administration is not prepared to separate or distinguish between cold and warm calls, I think is something good. But then what I'd like to say is, members of the public might not be able to understand very well that you can distinguish between whether or not it's a cold or warm call by looking at the caller display. That's why they have not expressed any enthusiasm on this. And if we can confine certain groups of numbers so that members of the public will be able to readily identify them, then that might be an entirely different story. Yes, Mr. Xiu, I think, well, when you try to market your services or products, you will have to do it in several ways, either trying to put up advertisements on TV and so on. And if you are well off enough, then you can have advertisements on TV or radio and so on. But then for the SMEs, if they are not, if they do not have the resources to put up advertisements, then how are they able to identify their potential customers? Well, apparently most of the respondents supported legislation, but then as you have made it clear, all right, one of the cons would be that you would not be able to regulate calls that are made from overseas jurisdictions. You can only regulate local calls. All right, for the 7,000 people in the industry, they will immediately lose their jobs. And also, for people calling from overseas, in fact, they will still be able to access local recipients. You cannot ban them. Just now, some members said that there are 4 industries and they have their wrong code of practice, and apparently they have not been effective. I don't quite agree because, well, as the CA put it, well, in 2012, there were some 10 such cases or complaints or inquiries. But then since the introduction of such codes, all right, in 2013, 2014-15, that came down to some 648 cases in 2016. So that's very clear. So if the trades know very well how they should contact their customers, then they would not be breaking the rules. All right, when people call them up, well, have anybody ever received any call asking you to buy a coffin or whatever? So they are mainly coming from the several trades, either the banking industry, the telecommunication, or the insurance companies, and so on. Okay, during the last couple of years, we receive more calls that pretend to be from the beauty industry or from the lending institutions and so on. Yes, they are receiving more such cold calls. Well, if you know where the problems are, why don't you just focus on those trades so that they can introduce better regulation? In fact, recently I've also taken this up with those trades because they are fully aware of the problem. Well, for the 4 other industries, since the introduction of the self-regulatory codes, things have improved rather substantially. All right, legislation is easy. Well, as a consumer, well, of course, for me, the best thing is to only get the good things and not the bad. And then when I browse the web, of course, I don't want to see the advertisements. I only want to see I'm only interested in the news, and that would be quite a nuisance. And then when I watch TV, I'm watching the drama series. Why do I have to watch the advertisements too? Well, I would find them rather annoying. All right, I don't want to see the leaflets and all the advertisements on the streets. Well, can you ban them more? But then this is a commercial society. You will have to allow it to run on its own. And then for the SMEs, are you trying to eliminate them altogether? And then only the big consortia will remain, and only the big brand names will stay. So to the small consumers, will the price go up or come down? So we all understand that because every time it's easy to legislate. It's always easy. All right, for calls, when you ask the industries to regulate themselves, well, of course, that would also enhance the trades to come up with a self-regulatory code. I think that's the main direction to take. And just now, all right, Lang Kwok-hong is not here. All right, he said that he would be asking someone to call you up, Bureau Director. You don't have to worry about this because those would be treated as nuisance calls. If they are not marketing anything to you, then those would be criminal. Because if they are calling you up without marketing anything to you, then those would be treated as nuisance calls. All right, if they pretend to be from the immigration department, those would be treated as nuisance calls. Well, for these, you cannot ban them altogether. All right, Lang Kwok-hong. Well, if you consult others, if they tell you that they are just reflecting to you their views, then of course that's fine. Next. Lo Wai Kwok, thank you, Madam Chair. I think the mainstream opinion in the community is that there should be regulation and they are more inclined towards legislation. Well, in fact, from the PowerPoint presentation, we all understand that because in 2015, some 96% of the respondents thought that, such calls have caused nuisance, including myself. I find them most annoying. In particular, when you're overseas, you don't want to stop the roaming. So even if they are expensive, you like to keep the roaming services, but then in the middle of the night, you might have received a call asking if, sir, do you want any beauty service? All right, some 70% of the respondents want legislation, and then when you ask the telemarketers, well, a small percentage would prefer legislation. Still, there are some 10%. In other words, they might not think that legislation is a problem at all. So I've also noted that in the information paper, you said that the consultant covered some 17 designated areas as to what needs to be done, including the mainland Macau, Taiwan, and also the neighboring places of Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, and Korea, and places where there are more communication, including the US and Canada. So other than the jurisdictions, in certain jurisdictions, they have got legislation in place to regulate such P2P calls. All right, they have got practices. So after the introduction of legislation, would that also stifle the healthy growth of those industries? Obviously not, or else all the SMEs would have gone in these places, right? So I think we need to look at that more objectively. And at the same time, the non-legislative approach and also the statutory approach. Well, even if we were to go for legislation, it doesn't mean that the non-legislative approach will not work. And then if the industry can self-regulate, it might also be good. And if you are also doing your proper job, then you do not have to worry about legislation, right? And of course, how do we legislate? That needs to be sorted out, and the details also need to be worked out. For example, if you're familiar with that shop and if they want to introduce to you some new products, would you call that nuisance calls? Would you also report them? No, of course not. So if indeed we were to go for legislation, then in terms of the legal language, we should be able to deal with different situations, including what's to be defined as cold calls, hot calls, or warm calls, and so on. I'm sure we should be able to distinguish between them. And if the wording is clear, so Bureau Director, can you tell us what are you more inclined to doing? So Bureau Director, what's your thinking now? Well, we are still in the course of consultation. We have already spelled out our thinking in a paper, but then, well, let me take the opportunity to respond to some of the points that you have made, okay? Can I just respond to you summarily? Okay, you only have 3 minutes. Yes. First, I've heard you all say that overall speaking, you'd like to adopt a more forceful approach. Well, for example, by introduction of legislation. And secondly, you'd like to adopt a two-pronged approach. It's not just legislation. If there are other ways that can work, you would be prepared to accept it. And third, well, for the nuisance that might have been felt, well, that would also help to strengthen the pressure on the individual industry because they don't want their business to be affected. And also, fourthly, we should also think about how we can filter the calls and distinguish between cold calls and warm calls. Well, technically, there might be a problem. And last but not least, I've also heard you express your concerns that with more stringent regulation, what will the impact be on the 7,000 employees? Thank you, Madam Chair. As colleagues have already spoken on both sides, yes, we are all reasonable people, and even Mr. Xiu Ka-chen, well, he was rather emotional, even though he used to be a rational guy. Yes, I'm sure many members of the public have received such calls. Well, I just received two during the meeting. Well, actually, the color display showed that they started with the number 3. And, well, some colleagues talk about the prefix. I think, Bureau Director, you will have to think about it. And just now, Elvin also said that you can also have the number beginning with 777. All right, so long as it's a group of number that the public can identify with, then that would be easier. Of course, there are some technical problems, but then if you're not willing to do this or that, then the situation will simply not change. And secondly, very few people have mentioned this. I don't know if it's superfluous, but then apparently it's not. It's about the second point. Well, Charles Mock said that, well, for the filtering apps, the problem is that some people find it rather annoying, even if you have the register. Well, they will have to go through different procedures. It's quite cumbersome. So can there be any technology to make it easier? For example, if there is an app from the observatory, all right, the government can publish or issue the app, then there can be a central database so that people do not have to refer to different apps, so that there can be a central platform to deal with that. And then through a very simple procedure, they can also register the so-called do not call register. So you will be able to deal with that with one single platform. Would that be feasible? Well, in terms of the use of software, yes, that can be explored. I'd like to say a bit more about the prefix. All right, if you try to distinguish the calls with the prefix, then if you want to do a good job, then you will still have to resort to legislation, or else nobody would voluntarily use those prefixes. But then if you legislate, then is there a way that they can circumvent it? And if they try to avoid it, then even if you designate a certain prefix, that will not be used up. But then for the numbers under that prefix, that will be covered. And that's an unwanted outcome. So you will have to think about the effectiveness, because in Chapter 3 of the paper, we have also talked about which way is the most effective one. Well, relatively speaking, if we were to go for it by way of legislation, All right, unless I allow you to do it, or else you should not be allowed to call me, I think that would be even more effective. So if we were to consider legislation, so we will have to consider the enforceability and effectiveness of such legislation. Well, can we also combine the do not call register with the apps, the call filtering apps? First of all, I'd like to thank the honourable member for his view. But then in the market, we already have several such apps available, and they are already in operation. Should the government also join in to coexist with them? Or should we try to offer some help so that more such software companies would be prepared to provide such services? Well, I'm not against the latter, but then would they be prepared to think about it? So can that be done through one single app? Yes, all the views will be taken on board. Thank you. Okay, only 1 minute is left. I'd just like to say that, well, many members of the public are concerned whether or not you'll be able to deal with overseas calls by way of legislation. So please think about it. Is there any way that we can resolve this problem? All right, well, time's up. Let's move on to item 5. Once again, thank you to the Bureau Director. It's AOB under item 5. Once again, we'd like to thank the administration for coming. This is the last meeting of the panel during this session. Without further ado, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.